r/AskReddit. People who have been homeless. What was the first night without a home like, and how did you adapt to your new situation? If you want to join my giveaway for $500, subscribe and you will be automatically entered. Sleeping in my car wasn't that bad. It was summer, so it was pretty warm, which was my biggest issue. Showered in the gym and spent most of my day at the library before going to work. For the first few nights it wasn't bad. However, one night police found me sleeping in my car and escorted me to the local homeless shelter, which was one of the most terrifying nights of my life, since I'm lying there in a top bunk when a huge argument breaks out because one guy breaks out some meth, wouldn't share it with a second. Then a third got pissed and started screaming at them to be quiet because he needed to sleep. When you're a teenager, it seems kind of cool to sleep in the car, on the couch or floor of a friend or acquaintance, or for your dad to scam a rented apartment for a month or two without paying for it. Moving around every few months carrying everything that you can in an old Honda Civic seems like an adventure. We once moved a couch across town in it. We must have looked like a couple of idiots. Once, after a few months of staying in a place where we had no furniture, we're sleeping on the floor, the carpet of which was so flea infested that you could literally see the fleas hopping around. The landlord got so frustrated with us basically squatting in his property, my dad promised to pay and never did, that he removed the front door. So we went out to scam some food from somewhere and came back to find no front door, which in retrospect is a pretty awesome way to get someone out of your property. One of the ways we scammed food would be to go to the breakfast buffet of a fancy hotel, tell the server that we had a room there, eat a ton of food and just walk out. This was also kind of fun, but looking back it is a kind of fucked up way for a dad to treat his teenage kid. I remember being really hungry and acting weird because of the low blood sugar, almost delirious. This was when I made a futile attempt to run away from an abusive home with no money. I ended up going back because of that. I was getting high, so it really didn't truly sink in until I was broke and dope sick. Then the desperation started. Going to gas stations, jumping car to car asking for money, stealing what I had to. It was a miserable existence. There are so many things you don't think about when you're not homeless. Taking a shower, washing your clothes, and the boredom. Hours upon hours of nothing to do, and the constant noise. There was nowhere to go where it was truly quiet. Fortunately, I eventually got arrested for shoplifting, reached out to family who helped me get back on my feet. I didn't really realize what was going on. I was about 6-7 at the time. Dad said we were going to go for a drive and to pack my backpack with all the clothes I could fit and one toy. Mom was just crying. Me and my brother sat in the back seat. He was a little older and was holding our Sega Genesis and looking scared. We drove for a little while. It was already getting dark, and we parked in front of a Walmart and Dad said he had to rest for a while. It was the first of many nights we slept in the car. I remember one of my parents was always awake, with their hand in their coat pocket. Looking back, it was obvious they had a gun for protection. Sleeping in shifts. Edit. Jesus, this blew up and thanks for the gold. Trying to respond to all but my poor inbox. First thing I realized, at 18 when leaving home and finding myself stranded straight away, is that I wasn't yet and lucky as I had always thought. Female. Young and normal looking. Got support from loads of random people who deemed me very brave. It hit me really hard that if I was fat, or a guy, I would have been screwed. I lived in Spain by then and a couple of nights at a park was quite exciting. Just a couple of nights is what it took to get emergency accommodation. And nobody bothered me. Then jumped from shit job to shit job for a few weeks. Ended up getting a year-long apprenticeship selling shoes. Second, I learned that hitchhiking is very cheap and pretty safe in Europe. Just kept clean looks. Did loads of workaway placements and slowly got on my feet. I am 28 now and settling down in Cornwall, UK, which is the nicest place where I could ever imagine living equals. I lived at school until I dropped out due to a bunch of personal reasons piling up. My mom was mad that I dropped out and wouldn't even talk to me the first few days after, and my relationship with my father is complicated, non-existent. I took the train to my hometown. even though I didn't know what I would do or where I would go when I got there. I ended up staying the first night in my brother's room, not quite an apartment. Just the one room with a kitchen and bathroom he shares with like 5 other people. After that, I posted to social media that I was in this unfortunate situation. And a friend I had lost touch with despite once being very close offered that I could stay with him and his fiancée until I got a place of my own. I never actually had to sleep outside. And I found an apartment after about 1 month, so all in all I was pretty lucky with how it turned out. Oh, and my mom and I are cool now. And my dad and I are also trying to rebuild our relationship after he finally divorced his no longer new wife. I've always referred to her as his new wife even though it's been over a decade. I was homeless for a little while in the 80s. It's terrifying at first. You feel so unsafe. I was a teenager and wasn't willing to close my eyes and sleep on a park bench alone. So I went to a local shelter and lied about my age. They forced me to shower and do a pee test. It turns out the women in that shelter were scarier than the street, so the next night I didn't go back. I slept in a park but ultimately made squatter friends and stayed with them. It was very much a community and I felt safe and loved there. The biggest problem with being homeless in the city is no one wants to let you use the bathroom. Even park bathrooms are locked. Squat peeing in between cars can be done quickly and undercover. But when you get your period it's a nightmare. These days I have stability, so I never pass a homeless person without buying them some food or giving them a little money. And if they use it for drugs or alcohol I don't care. Living on the streets is hard. Drink if you need to, my friend. I don't recall my very first time exactly. I do remember looking for a friend that was homeless and his friends ended up watching over me. Everyone was drunk except me. I didn't sleep. More recently, less than a month ago, I lost my housing and everything I own. I'm alone this time. I sleep during the day and browse Reddit at night. I was homeless for 10 years the first time. And I am terrified now. I was only 13. The first night I had to just turn the fear into strength. It got easier and easier every day. I figured out how to get clean, where to sleep, where to eat. It was easier to get used to than when I got to home again and had to get used to staying in a house again. I was 18 and had depression. Only had to do the final exams and I would have been good to go. But I panicked and didn't attend. Which caused me to fail, of course. Me failing made my depression even worse. My parents couldn't take it anymore. Packed my clothes in a case and set me on the street. I had no idea where to go and didn't want to sleep in the city like most homeless do because I was too afraid of something happening to me or the few things I had while I sleep. So I went deep into the woods, opened a case with my clothes and curled up in there to sleep. Needless to say, I didn't sleep much that night. I was just disappointed in myself for being such a failure and cried a lot. Thank God I wasn't homeless long before my grandparents took me in until I found a job. When I had a job my parents took me back in and I went to therapy. I'm good now, but getting abandoned by my parents when I needed them the most still hurts to this day. Slept in my vehicle. Couch surfed with a friend. Squatted in an unused trailer. All while still working at a Walmart. Saved enough to get a crappy apartment and just kept going from there. It didn't really occur to me that I was homeless for a couple weeks. I was 16. And my mom and I were in a domestic abuse situation. She fled to a friend's house. And I fled to my friend's house. And then from there, sofa surfed for a few weeks until my boyfriend's mom caught on that something wasn't quite right. I had spent random nights at their house prior in the spare room. But during that 2 weeks I had stayed 3 times with them. And at dinner she gently put down her fork and goes, "Sarah, something is going on. Tell me about it." It wasn't a question. So I started bawling at the dinner table and realized I didn't have a home. And in the next 5 minutes, me, her, my boyfriend, and his dad all had our shoes on and in the car, on our way to the abusive house to grab my things. Then they made the spare room my real room for a year before I could go to university and get an apartment. I feel like I'm too late to the party. But I was actually born homeless. My mom put newborn me into a small laundry basket filled with blankets she'd been gifted. I spent the first year of my life living out of a car with my family. My mom had my 5-year-old brother and 4-year-old sister with her. 2. All living out of a Grand Caravan in the early 90s. She'd taken us to Wyoming to hide in the Rocky Mountains. So, at least I got to sleep under the stars at night. I've been homeless most of my life. I have stories about it if anyone finds this and is interested. The first time, I had to live in a motel for half a year. Each night was the same as the last. Cramped, upsetting, but dry and safe. The second time, I got lucky and was already staying at my grandparents' house the night when I became homeless again. Thankfully, they allowed me to stay until I eventually got a new home. The first night there was blissful peace and ignorance. I was about 9 years old, and my mom said we were going on a camping trip. I didn't really suspect anything, as it was summertime and we went camping a lot when I was younger. Although I did wonder why we were packing so much stuff. After a few weeks of camping, I started to complain, but my mom kept insisting that it was good for us to get in touch with nature, etc. Then school started, and we were still camping, and we kept camping for another 6 months. When we finally got a house, my mom cried with joy, and we don't camp anymore. Honestly, it wasn't too bad for me. I got kicked out but lived in a good area. I had a car, so I just parked it in parks and stuff, and it was only about 2 weeks before I found a new place to stay. It was also just me at the time, so I really didn't mind too much. Not all cases are like this though. It was temporary and I was lucky enough to have a car, a job where I could shower and spend most my days and nights at work. I worked at a kennel and theater, so I generally didn't get off until 2 and was at work by 6, so I wasn't in my car much anyways. It was also the early spring, so it wasn't too hot and wasn't too cold. I was lucky. I think people have this idea in their head that homeless means you're out on the street under a bridge or in a tent, but there are many facets of it. We were homeless for about 10 days after my mom left my dad. I was younger and it didn't click with me until I got older. Mom called me and my sisters and told us to pack up our stuff. We then just did what we needed to got those 10 days until she could secure some housing for us. I remember eating corn and rice for a meal, but that's the only real thing that sticks out to me from that time. The extremes most people here are describing are actually only the pointed end of homelessness. Far more people lack their own personal private safe space, but do have places to crash. Maybe it's on a family member or friend's couch. Not roughing it, but not necessarily super secure or their own. This applies to massive numbers of people. And it's good when we have such charity and support networks. But it helps to mask the scope of the issue, which is far larger than it usually appears. Currently homeless and unemployed and have been for 13 months. Homeless, 9 unemployed, and I don't know what the fuck to do in life or where to go next. Any and all recommendations are welcome. I am located in the US. My ex-wife made up a bunch of shit to get a restraining order. I got served at work while she simultaneously shut off my phone service and locked me out of our shared bank account. This was the 7th of January 2016. I had a t-shirt and slacks to wear for clothes, and nowhere to sleep. My car didn't have working heat. Thank God for my parents who got me a hotel, new phone, and some money for clothes. I ended up living in an extended stay hotel for 2 months while I looked for an apartment and got my affairs in order. The restraining order was dismissed. The divorce went to trial, and I got the house and the kids. I've been homeless twice, but both times I managed to secure a temporary place to sleep after a couple of days. Those days, though, were among the worst I've ever experienced. It's just a sense of panic and feeling exposed and unsafe. And every time you go inside you tell yourself to enjoy it for as long as they'll let you, because it's raining and windy outside and you know you'll soon be back out in it. I have no doubt that if I had to do it for longer in either instance I probably wouldn't have survived it, one way or the other. So I can't answer the adapting to it part, but thought I'd share what I do know anyway. I was kicked out by my mother at 16 and spent 2 months homeless before the local authority placed me in foster care. I think what hit me first was how my own mother could make one of her own children homeless. I felt like the least favorite of her children. It all came out of nowhere. I racked my brain for years after, Trying to think of what I might have done in particular. Also the crippling loneliness you feel when you are trying to get hold of people to ask for a place to sleep for the night. I could not feel more alone in the world when someone would either not answer my message or tell me they were busy. I'm pretty sure I camped out in the park that night. Didn't sleep at all. I had no clue I was homeless. I went to stay the night at a friend's house on a weekday, and after not feeling hated for existing, I just didn't go back. I ended up couch surfing for 2-ish years until college hit. My first day of being homeless, I had to bring my son and parents to the airport. I had to make sure my son would be well, so I decided to let him live with my parents, who came to pick him up. It was awful. But I also timed it so I wouldn't feel the awfulness of being split from my son. I went surfing the same day and stayed out of town with a friend. After the short surf trip, I was truly homeless and temporarily childless. I messaged a friend to let me stay the night. The first of many nights. I also arranged to stay with another friend and her family. It was July. I only had summer clothes. I needed to be able to get my shit together before it got colder. So maybe I wasn't out on the streets, but I still had no permanent home. It wasn't as bad as the others posted on here. Months of depression lead me to travel with no money. I got to a really big city by train. First month I stayed at a dude's house, in which he wasn't living. Then I thought it was a little too much and decided to go to the streets, where I already had made some friends who already were living in the streets. The first night was weird. At some point, all this wandering souls gathered besides a train station and everyone started sharing the food they've got during the day. We ended cooking a fondue inside a big tomato can. It was the first time I tried fondue. Then it was 2 months of a routine. Sleep there, wake up with the sun, wash myself in the clothes in a river, and go with a friend to do stunts in a stoplight. Last night, before deciding to go back to my hometown, a group of neo-Nazis attacked us. Now I have a 1-inch scar in the left side of my skull. I'm alright now. Father of 2. In love with my wife and with my own house in the woods. It was quite brief. I lived with my grandmother until she died. Just after I'd turned 18. The building society, like a bank, had refused to let me have anything to do with her house and opted to evict me. So I did. The last week was madness trying to get all my stuff out. I gave loads away to different people. I had a tiny flat lined up, but that was taking longer than expected and the eviction date loomed. The bailiffs wouldn't extend further. So they came, took my keys, and that was it. I was homeless, albeit briefly, but I had a set of spare keys. So I just let myself in and slept in a sleeping bag on the floor with our dog until the flat was ready, with everything I could squeeze into my car in there. The rest of my stuff was tipped. But that's life sometimes. I did go through a period of being of no fixed abode for a while, a year or so later, as I screwed up on the flat and had no idea how to manage my money properly. Eventually got that sorted too. But it's a rubbish lifestyle. I lived in a minivan for half a year while I worked full time at an airport. The trick was not to actually leave when the shift ended. Or if I left, I wouldn't go super far. I could afford to eat a couple times a day and I had a cheap gym membership so that I could shower. The boredom was mind-numbing, but if it got too bad I would just go back to the airport and people watch or pretend like I was about to fly somewhere. Never missed my family so much. Eventually gave up and moved back home. When I was in grade 9, my mom had finally gotten out of an abusive relationship. Her friend from work let us stay at their house for about a month, then we had to move into a battered women's shelter for about 6 months. We had a big room with 4 beds in each room and a pin pad to get into the room. Being 14 years old, I definitely knew what was going on and was pretty embarrassed by it and didn't tell anyone what we were going through. My mom, sister and I were still all together though, so it could have been a lot worse. In the end we bought a house, are all in good places now. If anyone's interested I can go into more detail about stuff. Edit. Spelling mistake. It sucked. It was freezing. I learned how to start a fire with very little supplies though. Tortilla chips Doritos are great fire starters. Once I acquired a tent it was much more tolerable. I wasn't homeless in the living on the streets kind of way, but I did end up couch surfing for a couple of months. It's hard to describe the disconnect with wanting to go home only to realize you don't really have one. The first night wasn't really a big event for me because I knew I'd be couch surfing for a month or two. It was really the little realizations that I had no home to go back to. That all my stuff was locked up in a storage space and I only have what was in my backpack that got to me sometimes. Moved to a new city and didn't have an advance to pay enough for hotels. Couldn't find a place to accept my rent application. So, homeless. Had just enough to eat. But waiting on that paycheck was a killer. First few nights weren't too bad. I knew a few places I could crash for one night and no one would comment. Dorm common rooms. University 24 hours computer labs. A church rec room I knew to always be unlocked. I never used any one place more than once if I could avoid it. To keep from being suspected as being homeless instead of some random who came for a party and crashed out. But as things went on and I still couldn't get an apartment in the new city, the dread of the evening really started to settle in and get loud. Started relying on the only place I knew to be my own, the car. But it was cold and uncomfortable, and while parking and shelter in safe places isn't as hard as finding safe places to sleep outside a car, it is still hard. Too public and you risk attention. Too private and you risk being unable to reach help. Or trespassing. Absolutely sucked and still does. I slept in a shopping mall that happened to be open all night. The next day I was able to get in supported housing that is shared with other people. Fortunately my phone is paid off and I have unlimited data, so that gives me something to do as I was big into gaming before all this shit happened. I'm currently living on one bowl of oats a day until next week when hopefully I receive some government help. I don't take drugs, drink alcohol, and I have no possessions to sell for food. The thought of eating something such as pizza or a roast dinner sounds so amazing, but it's so far away that I try not to think about it. I spend my time watching streamers and browsing Reddit. You would no believe the amount of reposts when you spend so much time on here, lol. I was homeless for a couple of months a year or two ago. I had a car and a low paying job, so I lived in the woods in a tent for a bit. The first night was miserable. I ended up sleeping really uncomfortably in the passenger seat of my car and it was a really cold night. After that I got a tent and slept on an old climbing pad I had. The first night was hell, but the next several weeks were actually not so bad. I had a spot in the woods where I was well hidden and would cook over a fire. I really didn't have it that bad, but it gave me quite a bit of sympathy for people who really do end up on the streets in a much more desperate situation. Shit is not easy. I'm currently homeless. Have been for about 4 months. The one emotion that stands out amongst the rest is anxiety. Constant. Chronic. Crippling anxiety. I've worked full time since before I lost my housing, so I have minimum basics covered, but I'm terrified I'll never get ahead enough to move back indoors. It's constantly waiting for the next thing to go wrong, break, get stolen. It's knowing it's healthier to buy supermarket food but can only afford dollar store canned goods and have nowhere to cook anyway. It's being uncomfortable anytime you're home. It's shame and self-hatred for letting it get this far. It's isolation because you're too embarrassed to tell all your well-off friends you've failed at one of the most basic human needs. It's mind-boggling how I have never had a drug or alcohol issue, but I'm now living right alongside those who do. All this because I couldn't work while I was in the hospital and have zero support system in my life to go to for help. It's dehumanizing and I'm ashamed of myself, to be honest. Earlier this summer we spent a month sleeping in my boyfriend's car. It was freeing not to be around people I hate, but I could only say that because I had the luxury of his car, with the windows covered at night, versus a shelter. It got very hot though. So we'd spend all day up until 10 or 11 outside of the car, showering at the gym and going to sleep in the hospital parking garage. He was working then, so we ate a ton of fast food. There were nights where he did sleep at the house and I slept in the car, not being welcome. So I begged for a blade for self-defense, thinking I was going to try to take some would-be attacker down with me. We are back on his parents' property now, but in the garage instead of the house. Honestly though, I still feel like I haven't had a home in the 6 years I've been living here, and my boyfriend hates it here too because of the aftermath of the conflict between myself and his brother's girlfriend. I get food and shelter, but I still feel kind of homeless. The closest I got to being homeless was when I was 19. I was kicked out by my old landlord because he wanted to do renovations to be able to justify raising the rent to other, more well-off tenants. The first night I slept in my car. After that, a mate of mine let me crash at his place. So, I spent 6 months sleeping on my mate's couch. Does that count? It was surreal. I was at one of my lower points, freshly 21, and I met a bunch of people that traveled with Renaissance festivals. So when my lease was up, and I didn't find a new apartment, I went to the campground where all these vagabonds were staying and ended up staying in a guy's doghouse next to his tent that he had constructed out of tarps and scrap wood with his dogs. Overall the night was good, for I still had my Adderall and money for liquor. I ended up traveling with those people for a few years, working Ren fairs, partying, seeing the different parts of the US, just being completely free. My experience may kinda differ, and it was actually recently I was homeless. I was in a rough financial situation, so I used the last bit of money on a tent, a lock, some food and a bunch of plastic bottles of vodka. I worked a kitchen job with a woodsy area next to it and set up my tent out there. I'd basically just hang around the woods fucking off, climbing trees, trying to build various things until I had to work. Went to work, came back to the tent, put a lock on the zippers and drink myself to sleep watching YouTube. I charge my phone at work. I had a Planet Fitness membership since it was $15 a month. Go to the gym to shower and all that. After a couple months I'd saved up enough for a place in a new state. My stepdad destroyed my stuff and his mom lied to the police and said I hit him. My mom was locked up at the time due to protecting stepdad from drug charges. This happened on my 19th birthday, which is mid-January. There was snow on the ground and I left with nothing but a trash bag of clothes. I luckily had some friends that let me couch surf till it was almost spring, but I ended up under an overpass, coincidentally one right by my mom's prison. I already had been abusing cough medicine, but I stepped it up after that point and never really got my shit together till about 10 years later. Sorry for formatting. Mobile. Edit. Spelling on a word. I grew up busking and begging because my druggy parents couldn't remember to take care of me. I knew most of the homeless in my area because of that, so when I ran away I knew things like who to talk to and where to bunker down. It was quiet compared to the constant outbursts of crazy and violence with my parents. I felt safer because most of the more respected homeless people had known me close to a decade and made everyone leave me alone. Slept in the backseat of my friend's broken down VW Beetle. Used the light from the streetlight to study and get my homework done on time. Later on, that same friend would sneak me into his dad's camper at night so I could actually lay out flat and get a good night's sleep. That worked for a while until I got caught and his dad kicked us both out. Went back to sleeping in the bug. Got by using old airline toiletries and washing up in the public restrooms by the beach and nearby Burger King. Still made the dean's list though. I was 20 at the time. And it was the dead of winter. My first night was lots of why does no one care? Where will I sleep? How will I eat? Fuck, it's cold. Why me? Is this the end? The first night, I walked to each one of my friends' houses and eventually found one with their car unlocked. I slept in the backseat of their Honda and made sure to set an alarm on my watch to wake up before they left for work. It was shady, but to this day I'm grateful they left their car unlocked. A week or so later, I called family to see if I could spend Christmas with them. It was a resounding no from all parties. I cried. A lot. It really broke me. That situation lasted for a little over a month. It pressured me to get clean off the drugs I was using. I was confident that I would die or commit suicide if I had to live that way for any longer. Been clean 7 years now. Being homeless humbled me. I'm no longer the arrogant, selfish arsehole that put himself in that situation. This'll probably get buried, but oh well. I was 19. Parents didn't want to help and I didn't have enough money for deposits on a place. I called my little brother and asked if I could use his tent. I had a couple of bags, some decent camping gear, etc. I found a patch of woodland within walking distance to my job. It really sucks when you talk to all your friends and they aren't interested in helping, or they just ghost you. The first night was really surreal. Being worried about my phone battery dying. Feeling exposed. Hearing noises all night. Leaving my tent and my stuff was the worst bit of my day. Being worried I was going to get back to my stuff gone or trashed. Really horrible feeling. You get used to it after a while. But everything takes thought. How much water do I have? What if my work clothes get wet? Do I have batteries for my torch? What happens if I need help in the middle of the night? I have a great friend who came and camped with us a lot. It made it a lot funner and really helped with the anxiety. After a few weeks I had enough money to get sorted. I now have a serious phobia of that happening again. I'd never leave myself without enough emergency money again. It was terrifying and cold and hungry. I didn't sleep a wink. I adapted over time. Extremely steep learning curve to surviving homelessness. Nothing really prepares you for it. I walked for as long as I could and passed out on a bench in front of a church. So someone woke me up and asked if I was okay in the morning, and I explained the situation, and then they told me to leave since it was private property and there would be people there soon and they didn't want me making the place look bad. As soon as the words left his mouth I realized that I was already viewed as less than human after one night. I ended up going to work still, as I never told them I was kicked out of my home and showering at the local community college since they never checked to see if the people using the gym were students. Eventually I got back on my feet, and even now that I'm not homeless I still feel that way inside often. Like I'm less than human. Was in Paris. Managed to never sleep outside cause I had great friends. Went to one's place during a month or two. Then to somebody else's. Sometime when I felt that I was taking too much place, I'd go out and hooked up with girls. One night at a time. When I first had a place I could call home after 2 years of this shit, it felt like a true relief. Been homeless by choice while living in Vegas. Saving up money for a new apartment. Truck stops are a great place to take a shower for cheap if nowhere else. I left an alcohol treatment center over 3 years ago. Started traveling the country. First night I slept in my car and felt like a loser. Had one of the best wake ups ever and decided to see where this new life will take me. Now after hitting all lower 48 and driving 250k plus miles, it was the best thing I ever did. I can upload a pic of my wake up spot at first day later if anyone is interested. Edit my first wake up spot. I wasn't on the streets, but my alcoholic mother kicked me out the second I turned 18. It was a desperate scramble each day trying to find somewhere to stay. I felt like an inconvenience. The panic if my phone was about to die and I hadn't arranged somewhere to stay for the night. Ugh. Luckily I was semi-intelligent. Worked my ass off through college and enrolled into uni. Loads of debt but a room. At least. For me it was note of an on-off for a long time with couch surfing and when I was younger living in tents. I guess the closest answer I have it when my aunt took me in. I had been staying with a friend after a long time trying to find safe placing to stay at night, but this was the first time someone asked me to come stay with them. It was weird. It didn't feel real and I had to adjust to living with 3 much younger kids. I felt like I was walking on eggshells and I had to get to know this family I barely knew. I'm super grateful and adjusted pretty quickly. I was able to finish high school and start at the local JC while with her. I adore my aunt for giving me a solid chance. Reading these makes me feel good. I love seeing the people who were helped or who got out of their rut. It's motivating. I was homeless as a kid, but my mom always found a friend I could stay with. Or a hotel. Some roof. Then I hit 18 and went through some legal stuff. Lost the apartment I was in, but my buddy still gave me a place to stay. I'm doing very well in my life right now and I show an incredible loyalty to those who show it to me. Very blessed and thankful. Those public breakfast for kids at school in the morning, those things gave kids with no stability something to look forward to. Food was warm. Milk was cold. I'm going to cry because yesterday I turned 30/went skydiving and had delicious food and I haven't struggled in 8 years and I'm just grateful for everyone's help. Ever. Thank everyone with kindness in their hearts. A lot of people do not lose their homes abruptly. They just sort of fade into the homeless realm by slowly disassociating from their public lives and losing control of their ability or desire to pay for homes. I lived in my friend's car for a while, if that counts. It pretty much felt like camping or sleeping one off after a tailgate party. And honestly, I was just stoked to not have to go home. Note, I was 15, working at McDonald's, and my stepmom made home life literally so unbearable I'd rather be homeless. Even after I got a place, no one in my family knew where I was until my brother just so happened to drive by and recognize my car parked outside 2 years later. I was 13 when my family was homeless. We had just finished the school year when our landlord showed up and told us we had 5 days to move out and we had nowhere to go. My parents didn't tell me what was going on, but I could figure it out. My parents told us we were going camping and that we had to move everything into a storage unit. So once we sloppily packed up and moved all of our possessions into a storage unit, we went to the campgrounds that we had been to a few times before and set up camp. The first night was a bit rough, but just from the aspect of sleeping on the ground. In my head I knew what was going on and just kind of acknowledged it as I have no control over the situation. Let's see where this goes. First night my wife and I landed up sleeping outside. We slept in a local park that I knew. We had come down from the countryside with a few rands, enough for one meal maybe, and had hoped to stay with a friend. He was unable to give us a place to stay, so we had to sleep outside. After the insecurity of that first night, I told my wife that we have to find a safer place to sleep. So we climbed up the slopes of Table Mountain, about a 1-hour walk, and found quite an obscured spot amongst some bushes and trees. We cleared it out of sticks and rocks, made it a bit habitable, and then went back to the city looking for work. We'd spend the day going from one place to the next looking for work until it started growing dark. Then we'd head up the mountain to our little spot for the night. Did that daily for a month until we were able to secure a small shack room in the townships, where we stayed for another few months until I get a job offer. Was my wife's temp waitering jobs that kept us fed whilst I was looking for work. Biggest challenge was mental. Keeping focused, clean, looking presentable, and just making my job looking for a job. Not me, but my math teacher in high school had lost an arm while woodworking. He lived for 1 year on the streets after losing his job and becoming depressed. One guy, he called him an angel, adopted him and took care of him until he could get back on his feet, which he did, and became a math teacher. I was 15. Northern England. I was sitting in the train station waiting room, not knowing where to go. There was an attendant who locked me in there so that I'd be safe. Said he had a daughter my age. There were padded benches and a toilet, so it was invaluable as a home until I was able to find a job and room to rent as soon as I was 16. I wouldn't have been able to keep going to school or get a job if I hadn't had somewhere to get kind of a good night's sleep and wash in the sink. I was 17. I hit a car with my dad's Corvette. It wasn't that big of a deal. It was just a little damage to the front. Well, the guy I hit called my dad before I got home and told him a bunch of BS. Said his bumper fell off of his car and read my dad the riot act. When I got home I walked through the front door. My dad hit me in the chest and knocked me back through the doorway. He screamed at me and told me to get out of his life. I went to the Redondo Beach Pier where I hung out and stayed sleeping under the pier. The first night, and most nights after that, were a series of moments of having no idea what to do. I was lost. After 7 months I called my maternal grandparents and asked them for help. They moved me back to Arizona and got me into college. Edit man. I haven't thought of that in years. A sudden wave of emotion just washed over me. I miss my grandma and grandpa. They were so good to me. Was in a van with another guy. Wasn't bad at all. Boredom is high though. Spent most of the time talking about how to design a vehicle for the Paris-Dakar rally. Only lived homeless for a year. Cruised the UK and Western Europe in said van. Until it finally failed. Then went home and got a job. Been cursing my exit ever since. I was technically homeless for a month this year. I planned for the end of my lease poorly this summer and didn't have a place lined up right after. I still had my job. I packed all of my things into a storage locker, bought a plywood board and a cheap twin mattress to put in the back of my Suburban and some curtains. It was summer, so the worst part was a little heat. I basically had a month-long camping trip at a campground just outside of town where I paid $75 a week for a tent spot and use of the showers. All in all, it was a bit uncomfortable, but I made it out alive. Got hit on by a gay man. That was a bit weird cause I'm not gay. Got to see some beautiful thunderstorms and I went and took lots of pictures of nature on my days off from work. And I got to pet the cats that live on the campground. I actually spoke on the phone when a cousin of mine went homeless. He managed to ask a local pastor he knew for money and got a prepaid phone to call family. He said it wasn't so bad. And called me back a few hours later about the boredom. Said the mosquitoes were biting. Was feeling sick. And every place he tried to sleep was either too bright or too scary to sleep. Food was either obtained by asking that day for handouts or scavenged through trash cans and dumpsters by local restaurants. Also, no toothbrush. Hygiene destroys you before you notice it. Stay in school, kids. Kicked out of the house because of a physically abusive stepfather. Thankfully always had a friend who would let me couch surf for a bit. Had no car. So the one night where I really had nowhere to go, I was just sobbing at the bus stop for hours. Thankfully at like 1 in the morning my girlfriend convinced one of her friends to pick me up and let me sleep on her boyfriend's couch. Wound up staying at a roach and other creature infested halfway house for about 2 weeks. Realized then that I had no home. Not sure how I made it through that. And I'm hazy on exactly how that resolved. It was a pretty dark time. My youngest brother is about to be homeless. But in a different way. Kind of. He and his friend are picking up and moving to the Denver in a few weeks. No jobs. No place to live. Their plan is to sleep in their cars for the first few nights so they can find a place to live. They are not familiar with the area at all. His friend is going there to go to a gunsmith school and my brother is tagging along for the hell of it. They both have marketable skills. So they should be able to find a decent job pretty quickly. But my whole family is nervous that they will be going with what they can bring in their vehicles and nothing else. No plan other than let's cross our fingers that we will find something. Thankfully had a truck to sleep in. I had slept in it a lot before. So that didn't bug me. But after day 3, I went to drive home after work. And realized home was an empty lot behind a warehouse. That hurt. My story isn't as bad as others here. I had graduated college but was just working as a barista at Starbucks. My mom wouldn't let me move back home, so I slept out of my car outside of my store for about 2 weeks. The first day night was an adjustment. I spent the day napping at a park and then hung out at the Starbucks I worked at before sleeping in my car there before work the next day. My mom didn't know until months later. But one of my friends at work found out after about a week or so and insisted I lived with him. I started being homeless at 19. A previous foster parent put me out for coming home from college one night. And I had called up a friend last minute. When I started to realize I wouldn't be able to crash or stay anywhere, I am fairly certain I started to dread and spiral into a constant underlying depressive state. All I could think about was, am I going to die like this? Do I matter? Will no one help me? I'm sad. I'm scared. I don't want to feel like I have to beg. What if I'm stuck like this? Is this really my life right now? 19-26 was a very challenging time. I kept waking up in the middle of the night and would start walking home. I'd get a few steps then stop and realize I had nowhere to go and turn and walk back over and lay on the ground. The ground is very cold and I felt a lot of shame. When I was a teenager I had lots of problems with my mom. I pretty much chose to be homeless. I slept at a Catholic church across from my high school so I could still make it to school and graduate early. I remember feeling really sad because I slept where they put people's ashes. And I remember being so sad that those people could comfort me in death more than anybody alive. I used to talk to them. If there's camera footage I'll look insane. I never realized how alone I was in the world until I was homeless. And I never realized how cold concrete can be. It chills you right to your bones and is painful. Like and subscribe if you want to.